Hello and welcome to the Carteret Cast, the podcast for everything Carteret County. I'm super excited to be here again with Mr. Bob Guthrie, and we're going to continue our talks about World War II and Carteret County. So, Mr. Bob, if you want to take it away.
Thank you very much. First, I want to recap a little bit what we talked about last time. When we get into talk about World War II, the effects of World War II in Carteret County, and the personnel in Carteret County who participated in World War II. And I also talked about the 3 British sailors that are buried here. I want to reemphasize again, the debt that the United States owes to the Brits for their support in World War II, and the fact that they refused to surrender to the Germans when the United States was not in the war yet. The Brits fought the first 3 years of World War II without the United States being in the conflict. They began the war in 1939, and we didn't get into the war until the end of 1941. So they were fighting pretty much without the support of the world's largest and most important democracy. And I can't emphasize enough how important that was. So having mentioned that, I will also like to say the things that I'm going to talk about today. I gave a speech about these things I'm going to talk about today about a year ago at the Civic Center in a talk that had been arranged by the Librarian Society here in Carteret County. And I want you to know that if you're interested in what I had to say, a transcript of that speech is available here at the museum, and the cost is simply the cost of the copying of the pages. And I'd be happy to talk with you about that if you're interested in it. And all you have to do is come to the museum. We're in downtown Morewood City, and I'll be happy to meet and greet you. Today I want to talk about 2 Carteret County boys who were cousins of one another. The first was my father, who was Clifton Elwood Guthrie. And the second is his cousin, who was Edwin Bonner McCabe. They were both born in 1915. So that means in 1930, when they wanted to go into the Navy, they were just 15 years old. And going into the Navy when you were 15 meant you had to have parental permission. I alluded to last time I talked about it had been a tradition of both the United States Navy and the British Navy that young boys would be allowed to join the Navy. They were usually referred to as cabin boys, and they could be as young as 12 or 11. Now, the United States Navy had decided by then they wanted, the young people to be a little bit older than that. And so both my father and Edwin Bonner McCabe received what was called 90 days deferred enlistment. That gave the Navy time to check them out, to find out if they were 15, because there had been people who had snuck into the Navy. One boy was 12 years old, snuck into the Navy, and had fought for 2 or 3 years before the Navy discovered that he had come into the Navy when he was 12 years old. At any rate, so with parental permission, finally, my father at first was not allowed. His mother would not sign. And he spoke with my grandfather, and he said, "Dad, you had money to send my 2 older brothers to college, but the Great Depression took our money away, and now there's no money for me to go to college. If I'm ever going to have a career, I'm going to have to go into one of the services." And he said, "The one I want to go into is the Navy." So my grandfather eventually agreed, and he signed the papers, and my father entered the Navy. Now, both Edwin Bonner McCabe and my dad went to training for recruits. And after that, you were considered to be what was called an able seaman 3rd class, which is the lowest rank that there is. And you work your way up from that to 1st class. So my father is in the Navy, and he chooses certain things that he liked to do. He didn't get any of the ones he chose. he was assigned to the Black Gang. Now, a lot of people don't know what the Black Gang is. I should explain. The Navy in 1930 was the Navy that was built to fight World War I. Now we were getting ready to fight another war 20 years after the First World War. And we needed a new Navy. We needed a Navy now that was more modern. The new Navy was not going to be fired by coal. It was going to be fired by fuel oil. And my father's cousin chose to become a waterman. My dad didn't choose to do that. Now, a lot of people don't understand. Why is a waterman an important job in the Navy? Okay, now, for a steamship to work, you have to have a fuel of some sort. And that fuel burns water to make steam. And the steam either pushes a piston or it turns the blades of a turbine. And that's what is the propulsive power. The turbine or the piston turn the propeller, and that gives you propulsion. But it also turns generators that provide electricity, because the new Navy has more modern guns. They're operated by electrical motors that turn them and elevate them and feed ammo into them. So the newest battleships and the newest heavy cruisers are all going to have big guns, big cannons. The battleships are going to have 16-inch guns. That means the size of the shell is 16 inches in diameter. It's 16 inches across from one side to the other. That is huge, and it weighs a ton. On smaller ships, like the destroyers, the Fletcher-class destroyers, and I'll have a word about them too in a minute. The Fletcher-class destroyers, their largest gun is a 6-inch gun, 6-inch deck gun. That means the shell is 16 inches in it is 6 inches in diameter. So that's about what your hand would be apart from one another, okay? And in order for it to work, it has to be elevated and moved in two directions to aim it by electrical motors. And then it is fired. Well, on a Fletcher-class destroyer, that's the largest armament. That, and they had anti-aircraft guns. They're sometimes referred to as the Bofors guns. The company that produced them was in Sweden, and it sold licenses to every other country in the world who wanted that gun. And the United States wanted it, but the Germans did too, and so did the Brits. And it is sometimes referred to as the pom-pom gun because it had 2 barrels in the gun. And when one fired, it coiled a spring, causing the other to go forward and fire, and then it would retreat and the other one would come forward. And so it was pumping back and forth, back and forth, so it could fire like maybe 10 shells in a minute. And these were aimed. They were usually about 1 inch or so in diameter, and they were maybe 5 inches long. And these shells were going up in the air, and they were timed to explode at certain heights, but they could tear an aircraft apart. Okay. If you ever get a chance to see a movie that was recently made called Greyhound, it tells the story of the Fletcher-class destroyers, which were brand new to World War II. And there's another movie entitled The Enemy Below, stars Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jenkins. Kurt Jenkins plays the German commander of a U-boat, and the other star is the captain of a Fletcher-class destroyer, Robert Mitchum. And it's a perfect example of how the ships operate. In Greyhound, the Fletcher-class destroyer is part of a group of ships that are protecting a convoy as it goes from the United States to Great Britain. And it talks about the travail of what happens over a period of 4 days. And eventually they successfully get to Britain, but they do lose a few ships on the way. At any rate, Tom Hanks is the star of that show. And it was written from a story by C.S. Forrester called The Good Shepherd. And Tom Hanks rewrote the screenplay. And many Navy personnel who had commanded ships like the Fletcher-class destroyers have looked at the movie and said everything that Tom Hanks does in the movie is exactly what a commander of that style ship would do. In addition to that, and I recommend that you also watch, if you see the movie, you watch the making of the movie, which is attached to it, in which several reporters talk to Mr. Hanks and ask him why he's so gung-ho about starring in World War II movies and producing World War II movies and talking about them. And he tells the man flat out, do you know how few veterans of World War II are left? And he says, not only that, there are not very many children of World War II veterans left. And he said, I don't want the American people to ever forget how close this country came to being destroyed by Nazi Germany. And the fight to preserve our democracy is very important. We shouldn't forget it. So anyway, having said that, I'll go on with the rest of the story. The Navy is being replaced slowly with new ships that are being built. The battleship was the main ship, the most important ship of World War I, but it's not going to be the most important ship of World War II. The aircraft carrier has replaced the battleship as the most important ship in the fleet. And now those aircraft can do more easily the same thing that the guns of the battleships could do. So anyway, and the Japanese know this, and they're the first to take advantage of it. The Germans never built an aircraft carrier during the war. The Brits built aircraft carriers. We built aircraft carriers. Japanese built aircraft carriers. So at any rate, so that's where we are. We're sort of going to leave Bonner. We're not going to talk about him for a while. We're going to talk about my father. But Bonner becomes a first-class waterman, and that's very important, as I mentioned, because water is necessary for the propulsion system of the Navy. Now, my father, eventually, he does not like the first two jobs he's assigned to in the Navy. One of them is the black gang, and I've already mentioned that. The black gang are the people who stoke the boilers. They shovel coal into the boilers. He didn't like that very much. It's dirty. He's covered with coal dust at the end of every watch. A watch is 4 hours long, and then you have a few hours off, and then you may have to watch again, over and over again. So you're not working 8 hours at a time, but only 4 hours at a time. And it gives you a chance to rest and recuperate during that. But his second job was not much better. And I said, you didn't enjoy that either? And he said, didn't enjoy that either. And this is what was known as the breakout gang. And what they did was they went down into the bilges of the ship. The bilges of the ship are the lowest parts of the ship. And they got the food and brought it up to the galleys. The galleys was where the food was cooked and served. And so we're talking about number 10 cans, huge cans of vegetables. And we're talking about a whole side of beef from the freezers. So it was pretty heavy work. And there were no elevators. You were carrying these up ladders or steep stairs. So anyway, I said, you didn't enjoy that either? He said, not much. So anyway, on a ship, the ship produces not 3 meals a day, sometimes as many as 6 meals a day, because some people work at night, some people work in the afternoon, some people work early in the morning. So they've got people working all the time. Whatever job is assigned to the watch, somebody is going to have it at the next watch. And battle stations is a special watch. You are excused from whatever watch you're in now to go to battle stations, which may be completely different from what you were doing before. And the first crew that's called is the main group. The ones who come to the bridge are the ones who are best at running the bridge during battle situations. So no matter whatever else they're doing, the battle station bridge crew comes immediately to the bridge. The bridge is the central command area of the ship. The captain is called immediately to the bridge, even if the officer of the deck is there. He's called to come to the bridge. The helmsman is replaced immediately. The annunciator is replaced immediately. Whoever's on sonar, whoever's on radar, they're also replaced by the people who know it best, know those things best. And now the first crew is in charge of running whatever the ship's going to do during battle stations. Okay. Later ships had what was known as a combat information center, and it was right behind the bridge. And usually it was open to the bridge, so if a person hollered, they could be heard by the bridge. But they had a special person called the talker. He was plugged into everybody in the situation. And what he said went to all the people too. So whatever the captain told him to say, he said, and whatever he was given, information he was given, he relayed to the captain. A very important job. And later, the combat information centers of larger ships were put in more protected places because the bridge is kind of open. It's usually one of the highest parts of the ship, and it's usually in the bow section of the bridge. So just wanted to let you know about that. So anyway, my father had a third job. His battle station's position. He was a pointer on a 5-inch gun battery. The pointer is the one who aims, who tells what targets to shoot at. And in those days, they didn't have hearing protection. So when the cannons went off, it was pretty loud. And my father actually, his vision, his hearing was affected a little bit. He was always saying, huh, if he didn't understand what you said. The only time he really heard you is when you asked for money, and then he could hear better. But anyway, kind of surprised me on that. But anyway, my father was on the heavy cruiser USS New Orleans. It's a brand new ship, Brooklyn Navy Yard. They took it out shakedown cruise. You know what the shakedown cruise is for? It is to identify any problems that the ship may have as it's coming right out of the shipyard. It's a brand new ship. So they take it out and they run it through its paces. They speed it up, they slow it down, they make all kinds of fantastic turns. The ship heels over and everything. And so if anything's wrong, they want to know about it now, so it can come back to the shipyard and be fixed. Okay. So just as soon as the shakedown cruise was over, whatever was wrong was fixed. And my father became part of the crew. And I said, what happened then? He said, well, we cruised from one side of the Brooklyn Navy Yard to the other side of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I said, well, what for? He said, there was nothing on the ship. I said, what do you mean there was nothing on the ship? He said, there's no furniture on board the ship. There were no chairs, there were no tables, there were no desks, there was no nothing. I said, oh, okay, so you went over there to get all that stuff. He said, yes. And he said, and while we were getting it, a lot of it had to be fastened down to the floor so it wouldn't move, I said, okay. And he said, that took forever. And he said, and then we had to go to a place where we got provisions. I said, so there was no food on board the ship? He said, that's right. And so now we go and get provisions. He said, and we take another quick little shakedown cruise, make sure everything's okay. And then we really get loaded up, and they send us on what's known as the display part of the maiden voyage. And what that means is this. That ship is going to go to a place where the enemy can see that ship. Because the U.S. Navy is sort of saying, see this brand new ship? Look what we've built. So the first place it went it went to Europe, it went to Sweden, and Norway. And the Germans got to see it because when you sail into the Balkan area, that's where Sweden is, and Germany is south of that. And so the Germans got to see what it was like. And here's a heavy cruiser. Now, the heavy cruiser is the next largest ship. The next largest ship is the battleship. Okay. So it's the next to the largest ship in the Navy, the next to the most powerful, a heavy cruiser. And it's supposed to have, its main armament is supposed to be a 6-inch or 7 or 8-inch gun. But because the treaty that under which it was built expired, they were allowed to put a bigger gun on. So they did. They put a 9-inch gun on there.
Mm-hmm.
So now you got 16-inch guns on the battleships. You got 9-inch guns on the heavy cruiser. So it goes to Europe. It actually also visits France and England, comes back to the United States, goes through the Panama Canal into the Pacific, visits Hawaii, and then, you're not going to believe this, it sails to Japan. The other possible enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese get a good look at it, and it sails around in the Pacific a little while, goes up to Alaska, and comes back. But my father was not on it anymore. My dad had been given the opportunity to choose a new career for himself. So he chooses to go to the Navy's photography school, which was in Pensacola, Florida. And he becomes a chief photographer's mate. And he loves this new career. Mm-hmm. that he's having. He's learned how to be a photographer. Well, what does a photographer in the Navy do? Well, primarily his job is to be a photo reconnaissance man. That means he flies out on planes and takes pictures of the enemy's installations, and if it's during the war, the enemy ships and anything connected with the enemy, their encampments, and so on and so forth. And then he comes back to the the base, and the photos he's taken are given to someone who is versed in photo reconnaissance, and they can tell a lot of good things from the pictures that they show. When I was in college and I took a geography course, I had a lab that was connected with it. And I got to know the lab instructor pretty well. And one day I showed up for the lab, and the instructor came by and he said, "You are going to love the lab today." And I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yep. You're a student of World War II. I know you really do appreciate that era." He said, "You're going to like this a lot." So, do you know what a stereoscope is? A stereoscope is something that lays on the table that's got two lenses in it, and it's the right height above what you're looking at. And what you're looking at is two pictures of the same thing that are side by side. And when you look down in it, it looks like 3D almost. Mm. And he said, "This picture that you've got today was taken by the British in World War II of Peenemünde." He said, "And something one of the observers saw was very vital to the British war effort." And he said, the woman who discovered this was looking at it, and what she was looking for was something like a rocket. And she saw something that was pyramidal in shape. And she called the commanding officer over, and he said, "What have you found?" And she pointed at it, and he said, "That's exactly what we're looking for. Now we know what's going on at Peenemünde." Mm-hmm. That 2 days later, the largest British air fleet flew over Peenemünde and bombed it out of existence. Werner von Braun, who was there, was injured, and they completely destroyed it, and it forced the Germans to move their rocket system into a mountainside instead of being out in the open like that. So it's pretty important. My father's job was very, very important. Mm-hmm. So he was sent to Iceland. I have to explain this. Iceland was very important in the war. It was a possession of Denmark. And Denmark also owned Greenland, too. And they didn't want the Germans to fortify Iceland. So the Danish government in exile left Denmark and came to Britain because Denmark had been taken over by the Germans, and gave the Britons permission to be sovereign over Iceland. So they took over Iceland and they built a base there. And they asked the Americans to come and build a base there too. And we built our base right beside the British base. And the American base was called Camp Reykjavik. And right beside Camp Reykjavik, which was a sea base, a naval air station was built, and my father's photographic lab was built by the Seabees. The Seabees are another group of people vital to the Navy. CB stands for C, construction, B, battalion, construction battalion. But the Navy spelled it SEA instead of C, construction. CBs, SEABEES. And they built my father's photographic lab. And every day he would get up along with many of the other photographers who were there, and they would fly out over the Atlantic looking for German U-boats. Very important. When they discovered any, they would radio back to the base and give the location of the U-boat, and they would also give this information to the Brits. And what do you think the Brits did with it?
I imagine
they immediately sent planes out and ships out to try to find the U-boats and sink them. Well, you think the Germans appreciated that very much?
I can't imagine it, no.
They did not. So when some of these submarines went back to their base in Wilhelmshaven in Germany, if they had 2 deck guns, and some of those U-boats did have 2 deck guns, they asked that one of the deck guns be replaced with a Bofors. So they had an anti-aircraft gun. Now, I say this kind of cheek and tongue. It led to a near-death experience for myself, even though I wasn't yet born. My father came one day to the sea base, and he had a little bit of a cough, and he was supposed to go out on a Catalina PBY. That was an American airplane. And the best description of it is it's either a 2-word description, either one of the 2-word descriptions, or it was either a floating plane or a flying boat. It could land on the water, it could take off from the water, but it could also land on land because it had a set of wheels, but they were retractable. So most of the time, though, you didn't have to have an airport for it. You could just land in a body of water. So he came and he had a little bit of a cough, and the plane captain said, no, Chief, you're not going out with us today. I don't want you giving the flu or the cold or whatever you've got to everybody in the ship. So you go to sick bay and I'll get a replacement. That plane never came back. So that I would never have been born. So my father's life was saved by him having that little bit of cough that day. And I got a chance to be born. Interestingly, and this is a little bit of an aside, in World War I, my grandfather Harold was in the North Carolina Field Artillery, and they were in a French village, and he was the observer. He was a sergeant, and he was the observer. And he heard somebody call his name, Sergeant Harold, and he looked over the side, and a corporal had come to get him, and he said, Sergeant, the captain wants to see you in his HQ. And he said, well, I'm up here observing. He said, well, I'm your replacement. So he came up, and my grandfather showed him what to look for. The Germans had just vacated that little village, and the Americans had just taken it over. And he had walked away about a couple of 100 feet, and the German artillery opened up on that little French church and blew it to Kingdom Come. And the man who was in the bell tower was killed.
Wow.
So another near-death experience for me. But anyway, back to my dad. Years later, after the war, after my father passed away, I had his service record, and I went to the person who was in charge of Veterans Affairs in Carteret County, and asked if he could help me get a easier to read copy of my father's service record. Everybody kept their own service record, but they had a really professional one that was kept by the Navy. And he looked at me and he said, Bob, your dad was doing top secret stuff before the war, and you told me he was doing top secret stuff after the war. So what makes you think he wasn't doing top secret stuff during the war? He said, we'll never get a believable service record. He said, because his fitness reports would have all been faked. He said, we could go and talk to the man who signed him. He said, I never laid eyes on Chief Guthrie. He said, so we're never going to find out what your dad was really doing. And I had to agree that was probably the truth. Well, anyway, my father continued in the Navy, and after the war, he was on Bikini Atoll. And a lot of people want to know, where is that? That's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Bikini Atoll is this little island surrounded by a reef. And what's so important about it is that's where the United States conducted the atomic bomb tests after the war. Anybody who knows anything about atomic bomb, the first atomic bomb was exploded in the deserts of the far west. The next two atomic bombs were exploded, one over Hiroshima and the second one over Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever bombs we had left, those were going to be used at Bikini Atoll. The first test, they were going to do 3. The Able test, an airplane dropped the bomb. So what was happening is the Navy and the Army were cooperating with one another. Okay. There was no Air Force. There was the Army Air Corps, and the Navy had its own Air Corps. So anyway, the second test was the one that the best pictures of it were taken. It was the underwater test. In the middle of the test fleet, an atomic bomb was set off underwater, and it vaporized millions of gallons of water, and the mushroom cloud was huge, gigantic. I have pictures that my father was able to take, because even though it was top secret, halfway through the tests, the government decided to make it known publicly because they were establishing the Atomic Energy Commission that was going to do the peaceful exploration of the use of the atom. The atom was now going to generate electricity. It was going to be used by doctors. We were going to have bloodless surgery where you use radiation, to kill cancer and all. So anyway, the Bikini tests, they never did the final test because now they were afraid the Soviet Union was going to get the bomb, and they only had 2 or 3 atomic bombs left, and they were trying to build more. So they didn't want to waste one that they may end up having to use. So my dad finished up what was done. I can remember talking to him. I said, "Dad, how did you manage to get pictures when atomic bombs have radiation that destroys film?" He said, "We buried vaults that had the cameras in them." And he said, then we positioned cameras so that the light would hit the mirrors and would hit these mirrors and bounce down into the cameras. And then after the explosion, the vault sealed itself. So the stuff was safe. And I asked him if it was all that dangerous. He said, well, they did let us go on to some of the test ships. He said there was radioactivity, but we had badges that told us how much of a dose we were getting. He said, but I had a friend who was an engineer, and he was wearing a lab coat, and he went on board one of the ships, and something fell into one of the pockets. 2 days later, he was dead. So you didn't want to mess around with it. It could kill you for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my father gets out of the Navy in 1952 and comes back to Ward City and opens up a studio. And that's not the end of my father's story. But I'm going to stop right there and talk about what happened to Bonner McCabe when he was in the Navy. He was a waterman. He was on board battleship. That battleship was the USS Oklahoma. Do you know where the USS Oklahoma was?
It's Hawaii, wasn't it?
It was at Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
On December 7th, 1941, it and the Arizona that were right next to each other were both sunk. Probably Bonner McCabe never knew what hit him, but his career in the Navy ended there. Every time I would mention Bonner McCabe, because there were McCabes all around us here in Ward City, my father would get this look in his eye. And one day he said, if you knew how much it pained me to talk about Bonner McCabe, you wouldn't ask me about it. I said, well, Dad, who's going to tell me what happened to him? And that's when he told me. He said, no, I don't really want to talk about it anymore. So for the rest of his life, and I never mentioned it. If I talked to the McCabes I tried to find out about it, but I wasn't going to tell my dad about it anyway. My father passed away in 1999, and a few years after that, somewhere in the early 2000s, the Carteret County News-Times had a headline that said, "Body from World War II from Pearl Harbor identified using DNA." I saw that headline and I clicked it up immediately, and I said to myself, golly, I hope this turns out to be Bonner McCabe, because my father would be able to be at peace. And I slapped myself and said, your father's known what happened to Bonner McCabe ever since he died, because he's up there with Bonner. If he's up there, I'm sure they're there. I'll tell you why in just a minute. But it did turn out to be Bonner McCabe. Now I say, what did the Savior say about giving your life for others? There's no greater love than that. Well, that's got to get you into heaven. So if you're in the military and you die in war because you're trying to defend the country, trying to defend your fellow soldiers, sailors, Marines, I certainly think that that's good enough. I think St. Peter says, come on in. So at any rate, I'm sure that is the case. It did turn out that the body was that of Bonner McCabe, and I talked to some of the relatives, and I said, "What? You're more kin to him than I am. What are you going to do?" And the family decided they could have had him brought back to the United States, here to Ward City, or he could have been buried in Arlington. But they chose to have him reburied in Hawaii at a national cemetery there called the Punch Bowl. Now that sounds like it's a funny name, but it is the most beautiful of all of the national cemeteries. It's in the caldera of an extinct volcano, and it is surrounded by the lush, beautiful vegetation of Hawaii. In the center of this cemetery, there's a statue of Nike. Do you know who Nike is?
That's the Greek god.
Greek goddess,
Yep.
the Greek goddess of victory.
Mm-hmm.
And she holds out her hand, and in it there's a laurel wreath. The laurel was the tree sacred to Zeus. And those athletes who participated in the Olympic Games back in those days, they didn't get medals. They didn't get money. All they got was a wreath made of the leaves of the laurel tree. And she is holding this giant laurel wreath. Now, I refer again to the Bible. What does St. Paul say we get when we die? We get a crown of victory. Now, what do you think that crown of victory is going to look like? I think it's going to look like a laurel wreath. That's what I think. So, at any rate, that's the story of these two Carteret County boys. I hesitate to say any more about it because I get more emotional. The more I talk about it, the more emotional I do get. I will say this. In coming weeks, we're going to talk more about the effects that the war had on Carteret County and the people who came to Carteret County as a result of the war. I will tell one more little quick story. During wartime, what happens to the Coast Guard? Do you have any idea?
I imagine they patrol the coast.
Well, they do, but they're no longer an independent service. They are absorbed into the Navy. Now, doesn't that make good sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Coast Guard and the Navy both are on ships. They share the same uniforms almost. Mm-hmm. And they also share the same command structure. Captains and lieutenant commanders, and so on and so forth are the same in both services. The Navy sometimes refers to the Coast Guard as the shallow water sailors. That's intended to be a little bit of an insult. Not much of an insult, but a little bit. But let me tell you something. In World War II, the Navy was glad to get the Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. Because the Coast Guard knows how to protect the coast. They know how to maneuver smaller ships, not as big as battleships, but they know how to pilot these. They also know how to pilot even smaller ships like Higgins boats, which are very small. So the Navy was glad to get them, extremely glad to get them. And the day that the United States invaded France, every single Higgins boat was guided to shore by a yeoman, a Navy personnel who was actually a Coast Guardsman. And even a few LSTs were under the command of the Coast Guard, and the Navy was very happy to get them. And I'm going to tell one more little story. Only one Coast Guardsman has ever received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and it was in World War II. It was at Guadalcanal. They had sent a Marine detachment to attack the Japanese, and now they were cut off, and they were being pushed to the coast, and they needed to be evacuated. So they put this Coast Guardsman in charge of 3 Higgins boats, and he piloted them to their place. He radioed to the other 2 to begin going to shore close by, and he said, I'll use my ship, I'll go back and forth, and I'll draw fire of the enemy while you're trying to get the men off. And they successfully evacuated the men, and they returned to go away. And as his ship was bringing up the rear, protecting the other 2 from gunfire, a bullet struck him in the back of the head and killed him. The Marines put him in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, those Marines that he had evacuated. And a Navy admiral also signed off on it and said, this man deserves the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the medal committee said no. They only wanted to give him a Silver Star or a Navy Cross. And this admiral came to see them and he said, would you like me to bring those Marines to talk with you? Because I don't think you want to talk with them, because they don't want to talk. They actually want to beat the living daylights out of you for not giving this man the medal that he's deserved. He said, I think you should reconsider. And they did. And they gave him the Medal of Honor. So he's the only Coast Guardsman who's ever received the Medal of Honor. It has been a privilege to talk to you today. I look forward to our next chance to be on the Carteret Cast. And I thank you for asking me to be a part of this.
Yes, thank you for joining, and I thank all of you for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.